We will now go to the second presentation of this morning by Eli Kramer, which I am glad to introduce. Eli Kramer is assistant professor at the Department of Ethics of the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Wroclaw, Poland. He's co-editor with Matthew Sharpe and Michael Chase of the new Brill book series, Philosophy as a Way of Life, Texts and Studies, which organizes new translations of Pierre Hadot, as well as edits new studies on the topic. His first single author monograph is on the nature and role of the associated philosophical life as distinct from philosophy as discipline, and is entitled Intercultural Modes of Philosophy, Volume 1, Principles to Guide Philosophical Community, which has just been published by Brill this year. His work has appeared in journals such as the Portuguese Journal of Philosophy, Philosophy and Theory in Higher Education, Eidos, a journal for philosophy of culture, Syndicate Philosophy, the Philosophy of Education Yearbook, Dewey Studies, and the Journal of School and Society. He has also co-edited and contributed to collections such as Rorty and Beyond, book published by Lexington Books, in 2019, and Contemporary Philosophical Proposals for the University Toward a Philosophy of Higher Education, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2018. And today is going to present actually a co-authored paper, and he's just slightly changed his title, which reads Creative Evolutionary Genealogy Toward a Method in the History of Philosophy. So thank you, Eli. The word is yours.
Thank you. And can everyone hear me? Is the sound coming through? I just switched mics. Great. First, a little bit of apology and explanation of what I'm going to do today. I think it'll be a little bit different in orientation than many of the other wonderful presentations that are going on. And this partially has to do with my own background, which is I'm not a specialist in the ancients. My Greek is certainly not up to par for that. And my specialty areas are in the philosophy of culture, and another is in process philosophy. And this paper comes out of some areas, particularly in process philosophy, thinking about the nature of creativity, rhythm, repetition, and what I think is a less known theory of interpretation that's close, if you wanted an easy comparable, to people like Paul Ricoeur. And this came out of me, as well as my co-author, Gary Herstein, starting to think about in Hadot how he approaches understanding the transformations of interpretation in the history of philosophy and how they build upon each other, and seeing whether that can be fleshed out. In other words, we're interested in how one of the ways that Hadot approaches ancient philosophy, and whether or not thinking about there's ways to flesh that out in more kind of responsible and nuanced. You'll see why we think that could be done. Unlike Matt, this paper is pretty hot off the presses, so I don't have a PowerPoint ready to go. It is also unfinished. We just got a little bit of the sections on Whitehead done. So I'll read as much as I can and maybe skip some sections so you can get a little bit of the background and Whitehead's thought that we think will be useful here. And then I'll end on a kind of cliffhanger with some ideas to ask you all what you think for feedback. So with all of that said, let's dive into the text. I'm going to begin with a very famous quote from Whitehead. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. And that's actually Alfred North Whitehead in his main metaphysical work, Process and Reality, or I should properly say his work on speculative philosophy. While this famous quote from Whitehead is, as Pierre Hadot put it, something that, quote, everyone is familiar with, most are less familiar with Whitehead's explanation for this grand assertion. Quote, and this is Whitehead, I do not mean the systematic scheme of thought which scholars have doubtfully extracted from his writings. And here he means Plato. I allude to the wealth of general ideas scattered through them, his personal endowments, his wide opportunities for experience at a great period of civilization, his inheritance of an intellectual tradition not yet stiffened by excessive systemization, have made his writings an inexhaustible mine of suggestion. End quote. As Whitehead demonstrates in his book, Adventurers of Ideas, one can trace the transformation of many of Plato's ideas as they have shaped not only Western thought, but Western civilization itself. And he includes everything from the soul, the peace, to the idea of the receptacle, even in a mathematical sense of a cora, of something that holds in places. If Whitehead is right, how then do such ideas transform and develop across the millenniums? Pierre Hadot, as a careful and creative philologist, suggests in his essay, Philosophy, Exegesis, and Creative Mistakes, that despite Whitehead's dismissal of them, those supposedly narrow-minded systematizing scholars that doubtfully created an edifice of thought from Plato's writings are in part the innovators and culprits for this legacy for human civilization. In fact, from his essay, Hadot has developed an innovative and underexplored methodological approach to the history of philosophy, the history of ideas, and the history of social thought and practice. However, as we shall see, we need to modify Whitehead's famous statement in a very small but crucial way to be able to fully develop this method. From a Hadotian perspective, we should rather say that, this is me giving a kind of new reinterpretation here, quote, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of creative misreadings and interpretations of the footnotes to Plato. The critical operative here is creative misreadings and interpretations. For Hadot, the history of philosophy, especially in its pre-modern period, can, from one perspective, be understood as a series of intentional and unintentional creative misreadings and interpretations of the authoritative texts of the Western philosophical tradition, all in one way or another rooted in Plato's dialogues. He goes even farther by suggesting that one can follow the commentarial tradition of the classic texts of philosophy and see how even particular words, such as ousia, transform from infinitives to gerunds and other kinds of words, and with such slippage, solely transform the meanings of philosophical concepts and ideas as they've spread and disseminated. Hadot first laid out this idea explicitly in the essay I mentioned, Creativity, Exegesis, and Creative Mistakes, which had its origins in his earlier research, such as in Periphery A Victorinus. He then used it as a method in his full monograph work, The Veil of Isis, an essay on the history of the idea of nature, where he traces the transformation of Heraclitus's famous aphorism, which now gets translated as nature loves to hide, a personification of Thusis that has surely slipped well beyond the constellation of meanings Heraclitus had in mind. Heidegger himself gave yet another very famous interpretation, which is hiding itself belongs to the predilection of being. Hadot shows the minutiae of such transformations at several critical points, including the slippages and transformations and their legacy for our conceptions and engagements with nature today. While this method has proved immensely useful, Hadot never fully developed it nor gave it parameters. By not doing so, we find that his terminology is sometimes overly general and that he missed some crucial features of its fundamental character, especially at least speculatively for the sake of inquiry, presuppositions it suggests about the nature of meaning and process itself. Whitehead, on the other hand, has perhaps the most important philosophical account of error and creativity as two sides of the same coin, in relation to the clusters of possible, potential, actual, and almost actual possibilities that we engage with in our creaturely existence. He explores in Adventures of Ideas how meaning transforms in our processual condition, but fails to provide a close study of the particular transformation of ideas from one generation to the next by the minutest shifting of a word or concept or integration into other systems. It is for that reason that historians of philosophies and of ideas have sometimes grumbled about his overly generalized account of Western civilization in that work, which is even probably grosser than Foucault on this periodization habit, because he's taking an enormous scale of scope of focus when he wrote that book. In this essay, and for the presentation today, we seek to critique and further develop this method of historical analysis, what we call creative evolutionary genealogy, which here and after I'm going to use CEG as a shorthand for it. I'm not super satisfied with the name, but I'm working on it, so we can discuss that. By further blending and building upon the work of Hadot and Whitehead, we provide 7 topoi from which this evolution in philosophical ideas and concepts may be interpreted. So these are the 7 kind of topoi we see in which these transformations happen. And this is just a working list for the moment. Creative mistakes, anachronistic systemization, anachronistic synthesization, creative interpretation, creative anachronism, creative slippage, and creative abuse. I'll try at the end to give you a little example of each that we have in mind as we're developing these working categories. Numbers 1 through 3 have been articulated by Hadot himself. Number 4 is Michael Chase's clarification of Hadot's idea. And numbers 5 through 7 are our own contributions drawing from Whitehead. We begin in the first section by laying out Hadot's own approach and utilization of this method of understanding the history of philosophy as a tracing of what we call creative evolution, especially of certain powerful conceptual metaphors. What he takes from Hans Blumenberg, I'll prefer this term, rhetorical commonplaces, which Blumenberg generalizes from rhetoric theory. We then assess its merits and weaknesses. We then turn to Whitehead's approach in Adventures of Ideas and other texts to further flesh out the potential method within Hadot's work, while we pay keen attention to the differentiating ribbons in the history of philosophy from assumptions of exact repetition. In the next section, we lay out our synthesized approach, which includes the speculative axioms that underlie this method, and a full explication of our 7 topoi, guidelines for using it responsibly at the level of textual transformation, at the level of the history of philosophy and of ideas, and the level of thought and social practice. We conclude by suggesting further avenues for developing this method. Those last sections are not written, but hopefully you all today will give us some ideas to flesh them out. Okay, first section, Hadot on creative misuse in the history of philosophy. As noted, there are 2 central pieces necessary to understanding the underpinnings of CEG in Hadot's scholarship. The essay I've mentioned a few times, Philosophy, Exegesis, and Creative Mistakes, and the book, The Veil of Isis. There are also other texts where he talks about this, including in the interview of him, that in The Present Alone is Our Happiness, and a few other places. But I'm going to draw heavily on these because I think they're the most explicit on these points. While many of his other works draw upon this methodological approach, we've already mentioned this in his work on Periphery, the aforementioned pieces most clearly articulate the methodological underpinnings of this approach. We begin with these 2 works before giving an overall assessment of the potential of this methodological approach and where more work is needed to have a more fully fleshed out method in the history of philosophy. As noted, Hadot most clearly articulates what we want to call CEG in the short essay, Creativity, Exegesis, and Creative Mistakes, the second chapter in the 1995 compilation and translation of his major essays, which Michael Chase was the translator on, into English, Philosophy as a Way of Life, Spiritual Exercises from Socrates to Foucault. In this invaluable piece of only 7 pages, he demonstrates the meticulous insight of a philologist carefully parsing the transformation of the ideas in the history of philosophy. He begins the essay by, perhaps ironically, in an act of CEG itself, and perhaps unintentionally, paraphrasing Whitehead, that, quote, Western philosophy is nothing but a series of footnotes to Plato's dialogues, end quote. He creatively rereads Whitehead's broad strokes assessment of the influence of Plato's ideas with the exactitude of a close reader of the textual heritage of the history of philosophy. Of course, as Whitehead explicitly noted, such an interpretation runs contrary to his own approach in Adventures of Ideas, which is not interested in this textual scholarship commentary tradition and more about the broad strokes influence of Plato. As we shall see, however, CEG needs to integrate both of these perspectives. Hadot articulates historical historical focused senses in which this statement is true. So now I'm going into the text as he kind of reflects on what this Whiteheadian statement, broadly put, might mean. First, that Plato's problematics have largely framed the paradigm and trajectories of Western philosophy. Secondly, that Western philosophy can be understood as a series of commentarial exegesis on previous philosophers. Rooted in Plato, but branching out to other major founders of the main philosophical schools, Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, and Skepticism. These latter sorts of footnotes to Plato lasted for well over 2,000 years, from the Hellenistic period through the early modern period, with resistance and countercurrents such as from the Renaissance humanists. This commentarial tradition emerged in Hellenism, or at least became most explicit, where the purpose of philosophical schooling was not to incite creativity, at least in the modern sense, a largely disparaging term until the modern period, as we know, but to reflectively defend one's philosophical school and its way of life, including its foundational texts. As Hadot notes in another of his essays in the aforementioned volume, Forms of Life and Forms of Discourse in Ancient Philosophy, quote, "The dogmas and methodological principles of each school are not open to discussion. In this period, to philosophize is to choose a school, convert to its way of life, and accept its dogmas. This is why the core of the fundamental dogmas and rules of life for Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism remained unchanged throughout antiquity. Even the scientists of antiquity always were affiliated with a philosophical school. The development of their mathematical and astronomical theorems changed nothing of the fundamental principles of the school to which they claimed allegiance." End quote. Hadot points out in Philosophy, Exegesis, and Creative Mistakes that medieval scholasticism largely continued this tradition, and according to some definitions of scholasticism itself, might even be defined by the commitment to close commentarial reading of the synthesized Neoplatonic Aristotelian tradition alongside Christianity. And even if we were going to take more intercultural approaches to scholasticism, such as George Dreyfus does with Tibetan Buddhism, he would essentially come to a similar attitude about the relationship to commentary and creativity. There is some broad assessment among people who do this intercultural work that this is at least a dominant theme within scholasticism. Hadot shows that far from being more mere pedantic scholarship, this kind of dogmatic commentarial interpretation of other interpretations was at the heart of the most important debates in pre-modern Western philosophy. Quote, "The famous battle over universals, which divided the Middle Ages, was based on the exegesis of a single phrase from Porphyry's Isagoge. It would be possible to make a list of all the texts which, upon being discussed, formed the basis of all ancient and medieval problematics. The list would not be long. It might contain a few passages from Plato, especially the Timaeus, Aristotle, Boethius, the first chapter of Genesis, and the prologue to the Gospel of John." End quote. Whitehead's quip then is perhaps not hyperbolic after all. The stakes of reinterpretation were on the most critical subjects of pre-modern systematic philosophy, from universals and the nature of God to prospects for a good life, and were based in a few essential texts, especially Plato's dialogues and the Bible. While Hadot rejects the tendency of historians to reduce all earlier approaches to modern understandings of historical interpretation, and therefore criticizes modern historians for sloppy readings of the past, he does align with them in seeing several dominant ways in which creative misuse, what we prefer to call creative evolution for reasons to be explained, in the history of philosophy and ideas tend to manifest. Firstly, there are those who creatively anachronize by making philosophical systems from founding philosophers, drawing discourses hodgepodge from their contextual sources. One can think here of in particular, of the Neoplatonic systemization of the forms, the good, and the one from Plato's dialogues. Secondly, there are those who creatively and anachronistically synthesize different philosophers and texts into one complex system. Here again, we can think of the synthesizing of Aristotle and Plato carried out by later Neoplatonists in places like Alexandria, where Aristotle's works are read as preparation for the deeper truths in Plato. Third, and of the most interest to us, are the edifices of interpretation based on intentional or unintentional misreadings or interpretations of words, phrases, and ideas. Hadot uses creative mistakes for intentional reinterpretations and for unintentional errors. Although these can seem innocuous and innocent, over the generations, they have had some important ramifications for the trajectory of the history of philosophy. For example, quote, the whole of Neoplatonic exegesis of the Parmenides seems to be an example of such a phenomenon, end quote. Such reinterpretations, mistakes, and misunderstandings have brought about important revolutions in the history of philosophy. Hadot brings up a particularly powerful example of how deep these errors, intended or otherwise, run. Quote, the most interesting example of this seems to me to be the appearance of the distinction between being as an infinitive and being as a participle, which, as I've shown elsewhere, that's in Periphery A Victorinus, was thought up by Periphery in order to solve a problem posed by a passage in Plato. In the Parmenides, Plato had asked, quote, if the one is it possible that it should not participate in being, ousia, end quote. This is a quote within a quote. For the Neoplatonist Periphery, the one in question here is the second one. If the second one participates in ousia, he reasons, we must assume that ousia is prior to the second one. Now, the only thing prior to the second one is the first one, and this latter is not in any sense ousia. Thus, Periphery concludes that, in this passage, the word ousia designates the first one in an enigmatic, symbolical way. The first one is not ousia in the sense of substance. Rather, it's being, être, in the sense of a pure transcendent act, prior to being as a substantial object, étant. The étant then is the first substance and the first determination of l'être, end quote. For generations afterwards, ousia had been separated out into an infinitive and participle form, which shaped visions of an omnipotent, non-predicable God for generations to come. For our purposes, it is particularly important to note that certain terms such as ousia, or being today, are especially prone to this creative evolutionary activity due to their difficulty, complexity, and importance. And we'll add some layers to that too about what we're going to call commonplaces. More than that, they have metaphorical efficacy in our lives, as we shall soon see. They are liable both for unintended and intended transformations. This is something Michael Chase has been helpful with helping me think about. In Periphery's case, as a dutiful student to his master, we can affirmatively speculate that his reinterpretation was a tactical defense of his school, albeit through smuggling in innovation, claiming the authority of Plotinus. After the arrival of modernity, Hadot sees a transformation it began, where the dogmatic loyalty to a school is no longer the center of debate and reinterpretation. Rather, reason itself is who the philosopher serves in the form of discourse. After Descartes, the task becomes to criticize previous philosophers putatively, at least on the merit of their reasoning, not on the clarity in which they defend and articulate their school and way of life. Ostensibly, at least, novelty and precision of reasoning is now valuable, and dogmatic loyalty to one school is not. Yet, interestingly, this position too points in its own way to the road of scholasticism. And then I give a quote from Hadot on how he sees the way in which actually discourse itself can reproduce this pattern with this kind of ahistorical attitude of just reading discourse and reasoning actually leads to its own anachronisms and reinterpretations of previous texts. This new scholasticism perhaps reached its height in the logical positivist school of the mid-20th century, which both thought that it could clarify these ambiguities and supposed abuses to concepts and terms in the history of philosophy, while it vaguely created its own extremely poor misreadings of the history of philosophy. A question remains then about whether any interpretation of a previous philosopher's arguments can be completely accurate, and to what degree creative rhythmic variation is inevitable. We will turn to this theme later in the essay. In the Veil of Isis, Hadot draws out two further important dimensions to what we're calling CEG. As previously mentioned, one of the central threads of the work is treating the creative evolution of the phrase that's now become known as nature loves to hide. Hadot begins the Veil of Isis by unpacking why such ideas transform so regularly. In particular, he suspects that certain metaphors, rooted in a penchant for allegorical interpretation in the history of Western philosophy, has had an enduring force on our imagination and culture, and it is these images that continue to evolve. Drawing from Hans Blumenberg's famous work, Paradigms for Metaphorology, he seeks to show how, quote, certain metaphors, many of which cannot be adequately translated into propositions and concepts, for instance, the nakedness of truth, nature as writing and as a book, or as a world as a clock, enable us to glimpse the evolution of spiritual attitudes and visions of the world throughout the ages. These traditional metaphors are linked intimately with what are called commonplaces in rhetoric. These are formulas, images, and metaphors adopted by philosophers and writers like prefabricated models, which they think they use freely, but which nevertheless had an influence on their thoughts. And here these sentences are really important. They hold sway for centuries over successive generations, like a kind of program to be realized, a task to be accomplished, or an attitude to be assumed, even if, throughout the ages, the meaning given to these sentences, images, and metaphors can be profoundly modified. These ideas, images, and symbols can inspire works of art, poems, philosophical discourse, or the practice of life itself. The present study takes its place when the history of these metaphors and commonplaces, whether in the guise of the formula nature loves to hide, of the notions of veiling and unveiling, or the figure of Isis. These metaphors and images have both expressed and influenced mankind's attitudes towards nature, end quote. The topoi Hadot pays special attention to are these generative metaphors that shape our ways of living and those transformations over the centuries that often go by unnoticed. We're going to argue that actually philosophical concepts, really powerful, complex ones, like ousia itself, are of course a prime example of this phenomenon. And I'm going to use commonplaces as a shorthand for these. And I can explain why I choose that over metaphor if you're interested later on. The second important dimension in this work has to do with potential meanings that such metaphors have as part of their connotative interpretive field. For example, for the aforementioned Heraclitean phrase, Hadot breaks down several definitions of each word. And I'm not going to go into those. They're available in the Veil of Isis if you're interested. He concludes within just the interpretations of words and putting them together, several different interpretations of what the phrase could mean. And he himself introduces the phrase, what is born tends to disappear, relying on the scant materials we have about Heraclitus' writing time and context. While a strong advocate of entering the life world of authors to approximate authorial intent, through understanding the material culture of their texts, the institutional context they were written in, and the societal city landscape they were written for, Hadot does acknowledge a delicate ambiguity within texts to give one's utmost attention. While he is no deconstructionist and is explicit that he is not, he does recognize a certain kind of connotative tension available for interpretation in philosophical discourse, especially through commonplaces at the heart of philosophy, such as being. Even in the origins of this metaphorical commonplace, there is ambiguity for creative evolution. He thus ends the section in Veil of Isis by noting, quote, to write the history of thought is sometimes to write the history of a series of misinterpretations, end quote. I'm just going to read about a page more, and then I'm going to wrap up so we can go to questions. We would go farther. The best we can do to be sensitive to the way an interpretation of an idea slips away from authorial intent is to trace its transformations in the history of philosophy. Basically, we're seeing actually tracing the slippages and these errors or reinterpretations actually helps you provide the contrast to understand authorial intent better. Further, that process in turn will be revealing of the creative potential in certain commonplaces, intended or otherwise. While other authors have tried to trace the transformation of certain philosophical conceptions or commonplaces, for example, famously Richard Rorty in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, perhaps only Hadot has considered how carefully and textually this might be completed to give a truly responsible account of the transformations of what I'm going to call metaphorical commonplaces. Finally, we are now in a position to better understand the strengths and weaknesses of Hadot's approach. In terms of strengths, he has offered a unique way to understand and trace the ambiguities of certain metaphorical commonplaces in the history of philosophy as they evolve over time. He, however, uses terms like misinterpret for both intended creative interpretations, such as in Periphery or on Plotinus, and unintended ones, like many of the reinterpretations of the Heraclitean aphorism on Phusis. While this can easily be rectified by further differentiation of kinds of creative evolutions of metaphors in the history of philosophy, what is less clear is how to separate authorial intent from the ambiguity of language itself, the potential within language for different meanings, and the uncertainty as to whether all interpretive acts in some sense transform the commonplace under investigation. It is here where, in the section I'm not going to read, that we're still working on, we think Whitehead can help. I'm just going to end with a brief repeat of the list so far of what we're going to call these topoi of the kinds of transformations we see happen in the history of philosophy of interpretations on others. And so the first repeat is creative mistakes. For example, Husserl on Augustine on the Bible, which is really a direct misreading, and it's a misreading on a misreading. Second, an anachronistic systemization of a philosopher's discourse. And this is the case we're talking about what happens to Plato's dialogues. Third, anachronistic synthesization of philosophers and their discourses into one greater perspective or way of life. In the year we can think of Neoplatonism, of course. Four, so the first three, by the way, are ones we see in Hadot himself. Four, creative interpretation. And this is from Michael Chase himself as he describes what Periphery is up to in that aforementioned part on being that I previously quoted. 5, creative anachronism. And I include, this is me and Gary Herstein, my co-author. We would include Heidegger's history of being here. And what we mean here by creative anachronism is a certain kind of intentional reading of the history of philosophy that in many ways is irresponsible, but it's for kind of present purposes. Foucault, to maybe a less extreme degree, has the same habit that Heidegger does, and it's quite intentional with the genealogical approach. 6, creative slippage, the potential within texts that open up interpretive potentials that may or not have been intended by the author. Tracing this slippage is in fact part of providing a heuristic for permissible and impermissible interpretations of authorial intent, versus inevitable use and abuse with time of dimensions of broad potential within a text. So what we're thinking about here is what Peter Gay points out about the use and abuse of Rousseau by the Romantics on one side and the French revolutionaries on the other. In essence, Rousseau is neither a Romantic nor is he a revolutionary, but there's potentials when his texts that are kind of dragged and pulled out, and it's not clear how aware Rousseau was of it for other purposes over time. Nietzsche is another example here, even though there's plenty problematic in it. Obviously, Nietzsche is used certain ways by nationalists and fascists a generation later. Last, creative abuse. The reduction of the nuances of the history of philosophy to an overly reductive narrative. And we're going to include here Heidegger's account of humanism or Rorty's history of philosophy. I might also use Bertrand Russell's history of philosophy here, which is really just like flagrantly bad. We wanted to use this differently from a creative anachronism, where someone's doing a clever retelling of the history of philosophy for their own purposes, from just really shitty stories that I frankly are so reductive, I'm not sure you can get much use out of them. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to stop there so I don't run too much over.
Thank you so much, Eli. We can now open the discussion. So, are there questions at the moment from the audience? I see Michael Chase has raised his hand, so please, Michael.
Yes, thanks so much for that, Eli. That was your project sounds very exciting. I just wanted to add, well, 2 remarks. One was to add a potential source field of inquiry for you, and that would be in the context of commonplaces, metaphorical commonplaces, which, of course, the Greek for that is topoi, right? And you might be interested to look at the history of the Aristotelian concept of topoi, because obviously Aristotle wrote a book on that, right? The topics. And in subsequent, which are basically a storehouse of themes by means of which you can win arguments for Aristotle. But in subsequent thought, as early as Cicero, you find this as the topics used as a sort of a framework for discovering the premises of arguments. And it becomes almost a sort of a blueprint for how to discover things scientifically. I think that's a really interesting development. So that's a suggestion. The other remark I had was a slight worry about your use of evolution in your title. Now, obviously, when one hears about evolution, the question that arises is it random or not? Standard neo-Darwinianism says it is. What about the evolution you're talking about? Is it random or not?
Should I go ahead and answer, Marta, or do you want to put questions together?
Yeah, maybe better to bring the next question together. Yes, Hélder, please.
Thank you very much, Eli, for this very stimulating presentation. It gave me a lot to thought. And if I understood you correctly, at some points you suggest or raise the possibility that all interpretations involve some kind of mistake, and that would be an essential characteristic of interpreting, that it would always imply some kind of deviation. I wonder if this is the case, if you are trying to suggest this in some way. And in that case, I also wonder about what would be the opposite of this, an interpretation without mistakes, or to better formulate it, does these not require some claim of being able to see what an adequate interpretation is? So how can you, or how can anyone, say that something is a creative interpretation or creative anachronism without being what is exactly being interpreted? So without having a claim of adequacy. So in order to say that Heidegger is wrong or is mistaken about his interpretation of the Greek concept of being or something, one has to have some idea of what the adequate interpretation is in order to identify some kind of deviation. So I wonder if this need to have an adequate access, an adequate interpretation, does not render this problematic. So especially if you have this claim that all interpretations are somehow involve a kind of creative misreading, isn't it necessary to have something more than that in order even to identify a creative misreading as such?
Really good question. I'm going to start with Mike first, and I just wanted to note how you're just asking me, essentially the questions of the whole field of hermeneutics. So I will, try to do the best I can there, because obviously it's a extremely difficult question. And what I'm hoping hearing from the group is to think about on this kind of Hadotian insight, if there's not something we could provide hermeneutics that might be really useful. So to play the cards at the table, I actually think if you pull out of Hadot and flesh some things out a little bit, we actually might have something really valuable to add to the conversation. But let's go back to Mike. First, that was a really good suggestion on commonplaces. You notice we chose to talk about these different kinds of evolution, and there are reasons I'm satisfied with that term and not. Creative evolutions in the history of philosophy. We prefer to use the place commonplaces because I think those are better in a modern English sense of getting away from people to think that this is a definitive list instead of a starting place for thinking that might be useful as we're thinking about this. And actually, I think Aristotle's Ars Topica and conversation here is was helping us think methodologically about it. There's a second sense of commonplaces. That's why I use topoi in Greek separately from the English commonplaces that Blumenberg has in mind, which is the way, especially if you're thinking in a kind of mythical, metaphorical sense, a certain certain kind of really broad topics, ideas, images, so much shape our consciousness that they're almost not in a deterministic sense, but in a creative sense, inescapably shape the trajectory of a civilization. And so he kind of builds out of Aristotle, and he's really actually building out of one of my preferred figures, Ernst Cassirer, this idea that there are certain symbolical habits of our thinking that build such ruts in our consciousness that are very hard for us to kind of reinterpret our way out of. The best way is we kind of creatively transform them and come back to them. And I think ousia is one of them. There's a choice here of using topoi and commonplace separate to try to differentiate something that Blumenberg has in mind on one side and what we want to do methodologically at the other. But I do think going back to Aristotle would be good. Okay, on evolution. Obviously here I have Henri Bergson in mind, another process philosopher, and Whitehead to a degree too. Both of them prefer to think of evolution as organized change. And in some perspectives that's intentional, and some perspectives that's not. I actually think this perspective would really be helpful to talk about organized change in the history of philosophical thought, because they have a very nuanced conception of it. I can't go into the full deep sense, but the answer is no, I'm not thinking in a Darwinistic sense. And in fact, both of them tend to think Darwinistic thinking, at least when overly generalized from the context of which it was supposed to explain, is reductionist and deeply problematic. And obviously you get social Darwinist theories that are just, speaking of bad history of philosophies or histories of thought, you get Herbert Spencer out of this. So I do want to hedge away from that. I'm not sure if I'm satisfied with evolution, but if you have other ideas over time, we can talk about those, because this is just a kind of placeholder until I come up with a title that I really think is useful. All right, Hélder, on mistakes. We're drawing on here, interestingly, most of the time we're going to use creative evolution, but when I use the word mistake, we're going to, in the next section, explain what Whitehead means about it, which is actually quite interesting, which is when he does his speculative philosophy. And I'm going to give a very brief unfair, because he really spent a great deal, in fact, a great deal, if not most of his career on this topic. So he has hundreds of pages trying to parse it out. But that anytime there's a change from if we picked any moment in the universe, imagine it as a still image. Any change from that still moment, any slice we could give of the universe, is an error of sorts. In other words, in Whiteheadian language, error is creativity. It's a divergence from any present we might talk about to something else. He's doing lots of work on space and time we don't need to do about here. So in one sense, when we're talking about error here, it doesn't really matter if it's intentional or not. We're talking about fundamental change from what the universe was at any previous moment. And so in the history of philosophy, we're talking about, if we were going to take the Whiteheadian language, we're talking about any change that happened from a previous interpretation, a particular discourse we're looking at, a particular text to a next one. So there's a little bit of technical usage here. And Whitehead is famous for liking to use a very normal term and utterly transforming it to something unrecognizable. Like, for example, what he thinks a preposition is, if you really understand it, is so foreign from what his student Bertrand Russell or really anyone else thinks about it. It's a lore for feeling. And what he even means by feeling in that and lore is just famously just entirely something else. But anyways, so just some context for there in the Whitehead sections will explain what we mean by mistake. And it's a very particular and broad sense of mistake. Again, we're going to use probably creative evolution here to avoid some of the loaded background to that. Okay, last real quick on adequacy. This is part of what we want to build out of the hermeneutics. I can't really defend the position here, but what I would like to say, and actually I think it's in Hadot, but it's certainly in process philosophers like Whitehead, is in fact following the history of these, divergent interpretations, or when you can tell someone what Periphery is up to, trying to explain the text. If you have a constellation of the divergences, it actually helps you with authorial intent in a strange way, right? Because you can see the moves people around them are making to try to defend a position, a disambiguate, disambiguate or clarify something. A general process attitude is contrast provides clarity. So one of the way we can get authorial intent is contrast. Second, I'll add something of just my own perspective that I think is built into this, and Gary Herstein's, is I tend to, in the history of philosophy, like someone like Collingwood, who tend to present the position that there is, and I think Hadot has this too, that actually we can get an authorial intent to a degree. And we all know what, like a sloppy reading, like look, not a sloppy, but even a limited reading of a certain text looks like, based off what they actually said on the page. Look at our discussion of Foucault, right? There really are things Marcus really has said about our first story to the, the cosmic citizen whole society that we're a part of. Even Derrida, who lots of people have frustration, says, despite how deconstruction is used, is actually quite clear that there is only so much room for deconstruction in a text. It's not like you can go all about willy-nilly and do it randomly. So I do want to say it's a matter of degree. There's not some quantitative standard we can get to adequacy here, but provide contrast and knowing more about, as Hadot says, about the text, how the text was made, the material culture of it, who it was made for, what role it played in the school, and what place it made in the city. We actually can come to some decent adequacy standards that are non-exhaustive, but I think can get to a degree better or worse that helps frame that. Again, there's a whole field of hermeneutics here that would give me a bunch of hard questions on that, but I'm trying to give you the shorthand version of how we might approach it.
And I think Michael wants to react.
Yeah, just to chime in once again here. Obviously, there is we've talked about this, Eli. There's a difficult tension in Hadot, who on the one hand talks about the fecundity of creative mistakes, but on the other hand argues very strongly that there is such a thing as authorial intent, and very argues against Nietzsche that some, not all interpretations are equal, some are acceptable and others are not. So this is a tension that I don't have a very strong handle on with Hadot, but I'm wondering if one could use a model from elsewhere in his thought. When he talks about Stoicism and the idea that the idea that a Stoic, the goal of a Stoic is to become a sage, right? Yet ultimately, it could well be the case that no Stoic has ever existed in human history. But that's not really a problem, because the progress towards becoming a sage is what Hadot calls asymptotic, right? You get closer and closer and closer and closer. You might get almost infinitely close, but you'll never quite get there. And perhaps that might be the same thing with authorial intent. I mean, in order to achieve perfectly authorial intent, we would have to be able to know exhaustively everything about the intellectual, material, economic background of a thinker, and we can never do that. So that's just a possible model that may or may not be useful in helping here.
Yeah, Mike, just completely agree, and that's actually a good reference. I will probably use it, because it also fits with both Whitehead's attitude to our authorial intent, and again, this kind of Collingwood that I think we both share, which is, Collingwood's famous with also Josiah Roy says the same thing. What's the perfect, map of something? What's the perfect map of England? England, right? And so, they're also both talking about authorial intent and how to interpret discourse, and Collingwood says the same thing about entering the ancient world, that, the imaginative act of entering by trying to get as much information as possible to enter this life world will give you asymptotically, closer to authorial intent. But, you can't ever get there for just that reason. There is this imaginative act responsible. And Whitehead adds an interest, like kind of two layers. One is that, I mean, he tends to think very broadly, but does admit a point that, yes, this can happen. And also, broad understandings of creative evolution of these thoughts can actually provide us a helpful picture of the relationship to authorial intent, to the way texts get reinterpreted over time. It actually gives us a helpful hermeneutic tense if we look at both the abuse and the authorial intent at the same time. In other words, we need to be a philologist and also sensitive to how creative transformations happen and their value and impact, instead of getting too, curmudgeonly about them.
Let me just quickly comment. I wonder, just before giving the word to Federico, I wonder if this reinterpretation is really the right word here, because if an author is producing an intentional misreading or misinterpretation or a creative mistake of some other previous philosopher, is that not more like an appropriation, a reapplication, an incorporation of some insight on one's own thought, and that's somehow even explicitly or implicitly stated.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, there's losses with each word choice we do here, but I'll at least try to explain why reinterpretation. Again, it has to do with this Whiteheadian model that any previous act of, you know, a reinterpretation, or really any interpretation, is going to pull and do that synthesizing work you're going to talk about. And the way I don't use appropriation is because of this hard line we're trying to do with, if you're trying to be sensitive to schools, I'm going to use the word scholastic just as a shorthand here, that are really committed to defending their school's own interpretation, it is very hard to find the line between appropriation and, you know, intentional rereading. And interpretation, at least for me, provides a little more ambiguous wiggle room between both. And keep in mind, this is all under this broader category of creative evolution. Only one of them are we calling creative interpretation. There's also creative abuse and creative slippage, you know, which are these other kinds of subcategories here.
And just thinking about the intention of the one who produces those creative mistakes, because
so yeah, this is part of George Dreyfus's interesting point. Like Dreyfus was Tibetan, but I think he would, if he, you know, was making the case for Plotinus, would make the same case that for especially ancient authors, when they do this act, I don't think they think about it as, oh, I'm cleverly, you know, rereading them to defend my school. I think if you're in that mindset, if you're in that kind of Weltanschauung, you're that's not what you're doing. You're not appropriating. You are defending your school by clarifying the tenets that are available in the text. Again, this is a kind of slippage point, but I think this is why I'm still thinking about the ways to disambiguate these categories. But for them, you know, at least until the pre-modern period, and, you know, Tibet for much longer, this is something that Dreyfus actually think is a real problem in the Gaelic tradition as it tries to defend its version of Madhyamaka Buddhism. Like, even the creative reinterpreters, the most sensitive people to this that he ever met, still had to do it kind of on the sly and would never admit explicitly that they were doing this right. The best they could say is, you know, well, you have to, you know, debate and disputatio as part of unpacking the availabilities within a text. They kind of go a rabbinic route, I guess, would be the best kind of, if you're really committed to your school's tradition, you can kind of give the best wiggle room you can give yourself is kind of rabbinic, which is, well, available in the text are certain tensions and possibilities, and we bring those out through dialogue and debate. But they would, you know, never say, I'm appropriating. So again, for one of these 7 categories, it's all a struggle because you do lose something in interpretation. I admit it's me trying to like include a little bit of both of those because of the subtlety here. But again, we should have longer discussions because as you can tell, we're still trying to parse this out.
Yeah. I think Federico wanted to intervene. Do you still want?
Yeah, I'll just speak very, very quick here. I had a question and a comment, or just ask the question. Basically, my question is about the place of tradition in the schema of interpretation that you're proposing, these different options and modalities of interpretation. Because if you think of something, or someone like Gadamer, for example, you see that, I don't know, there's the idea that you only interpret a text within the sort of situated position of the text and of yourself in a certain tradition. And so the truth of the text is something that happens via this belonging to a tradition. Yeah, so my question would be, what's the place of tradition in your sort of framework of creative interpretations? Yeah,
as I kind of hinted at the beginning, this is a part we haven't fleshed out, and you're right to point at it, is that there's a few different levels you can do that. You can follow a particular school, right, which is actually important to see this kind of longevity Gardner's pointing to. Then there's a kind of next level, which is kind of broader societal context impact. And so like there's the school within the city and the place and what sort of legacies and tensions that develops. You know, Ilse Hadot in her book on Athenian Alexandrian Neoplatonism does this sort of work. Then there's this really broad kind of macro scale. Well, I would even say there's even a few levels in this, but let's call it one category for now, what Whitehead is up to. Let's look at the impact on civilization as these ideas generate and transform. So actually you need to work, I think, at a few different levels to get this going responsibly. And you could also, I could probably add one level of the individual author in relationship to their school, to their societal kind of social context, to their culture, and to the kind of whole civilizational efforts that are at least going on. And we're still working on that section. But I do think, and I am borrowing from Hadot here about thinking about a text within the kind of individual context, within the society, and the kind of greater civilizational effort here as the kind of broader category. So yes, it's needed, and you actually need more, because what happens when a school reinterprets something, let's say, the Cynics from a Stoic perspective, is quite different from, I don't know, Diogenes of Sinope in broader civilizational imagination, like his recurrence in the Enlightenment as an Enlightenment figure. Those are really two different stories that have connections, and the more you understand both, the more you're going to be informed on each other. But they really have very different scales in mind, and I think you get a different understanding of the truth if you're trying to understand, what the image of Diogenes has done across Western civilization versus what it's done, I don't know, in the Stoic school. But especially the Stoic school from the Aenean to the Roman imperial period. So again, there's also lots of work to be done here, because that would take a lot of work to really flesh out. But I think there's interesting possibilities there.
Okay, so I saw that Gianfranco had raised his hand. I don't know if you still want to speak, Gianfranco.
Well, just a few very, very, very quick questions. Eli, so thank you very much, of course. And what you said, your answers to recalled me a very important question. For instance, about interpretation of Plato, and recall in particular the debate about the unwritten doctrines by Hans Kramer, for instance, in the 70s and the 80s, and of the Deakin school, about the idea that the two interpretations can be at the same time correct. An interpretation of the textual Plato, for instance, and an interpretation of Plato passing through the doxographic tradition about the witnesses that we have from Aristotle and others about a doctrine that is not written and so just orally communicated. So in this case, as we have a not contraposition about two doctrines, but the two are convergent and can create an image that can be useful but available just through an historical and incoming interpretation. So it was an example for just to debate or a case of study for you.
Yeah, you know what that's making me think? I'll have to think of this as a separate category or it's included in the others. But there is, at least in some sense, a different kind of creative transformation which has to do with methodological telos. This is part of Hadot's complaint, about historians of philosophy, about how they read the past, because there's an easy, story we all know that the Hellenists, or especially the Romans, are bad readers of their previous generations, which to a degree is true. And even Hadot says, that there's a problem with scholasticism about its ability to enter the life world of the past because of its ability to defend the school. On the other hand, that's not their end, right? That's not what they're focused on. They have a way of life in a school they're trying to defend and reiterate and further define in order to continue that school and make sure its positions are sophisticated, not so that you can live this enriched way of life. And if that's your aim, trying to reinterpret the like some, I don't know, analytic historians sometimes have this, problem, right? That trying to just read the Hellenists as a series of arguments ends up frustrating you because you forget the context and the kind of language game that they were focused on, right? So sometimes what happens is a slippage is there's a category, a creative transformation in the ends of the text and the purpose for which they were used for other purposes. Two other quick examples of where this gets very complicated, as we all know, modern Stoicism. Can you really take parts of Stoicism, this is I know modern Stoics themselves debate this. For example, drop the physics to keep it as a modern therapia. Are you making actually a kind of category? Is there a kind of abuse happening here as you transformate the ends that this was used for others? And does that totally reinterpret the text and tradition that you want to be a part of? Another big one in intercultural philosophy I'm bringing up just because I think it's a really interesting example of how this gets very complicated. There's a famous Indian scholar, B.K. Motilal, who brought Brahmanical and Buddhist texts of the Indian tradition to analytic philosophy. Because, they have these very formal disputatio debates for over, several millennia. But he showed, see, here's how these arguments are efficacious to debates that are happening in analytic philosophy. And lots of ideological scholars question whether this move, you lose something in it, of not only the existential dimension, but actually misunderstanding what the authors are saying in the first place. Again, another kind of creative misuse. And Motilal knew he was doing this, by the way. He wanted to save the Indian tradition so it had a role in professional philosophy. He's extremely clear that this is what he has in mind. It's not like he's naive about what he's doing. So again, there might be this kind of methodological category here for us to think about.